Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Connecting Conversations with Cohesia Connect. This week, I am really excited to introduce you to a new guest that we have. This guest is someone that I've networked and engaged with over a course of time, and I'm so pleased that we can get them on the conversation today and share a little bit about their perspective, their expertise within this specific field. The guest that we have is a voice coach expert that specializes in diversity and inclusion amongst a lot of different areas. She has also worked with leading organizations both nationally and internationally. You may wonder why. You may start to wonder, what does voice have to do with anything diversity inclusion related? But this is why we're here to find out. So stay tuned and listen in. And welcome.
Hi.
Hi, Sylvie. How are you?
Welcome. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. And I'm so pleased to have you on and get your perspective on diversity and inclusion from a unique perspective. I think for a long time, we have been thrown the traditional avenues and perspectives of D&I, and it's great to bring in a new perspective, especially in regards to how voice interacts with this sphere and this narrative. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Great. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about voice and diversity and inclusion and equity and everything because I've facilitated workshops on voice and also just DEI. And well, I'll say that DEI workshops, when it's like just DEI, can be a very intense and exhausting type of workshop to facilitate. And with voice, I mean, it's my passion. It's everything that I've always done. But with, growing up the way that moving around and then noticing what made me me and kind of blending it together, it's a really interesting process.
I can imagine. Well, if we start off there, that will be really great. Tell us a little bit about your background, what you do. How did you even enter the space of voice coaching, shall I say? Give us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Sylvie. I am originally from Canada. My parents are from Hong Kong, and I was born in Canada. And so I was born and raised there, and kind of did the normal high school in a Canadian culture and that type of thing. Then went to university. People don't know what they're going to do or what they're going to end up doing after university. Looking back right now, everything I've studied has really aligned myself for how I fell into voice coaching. So I have a BA in communication and fine and performing arts. And so that's when I started discovering performance, and voice is something that you would usually learn in the realm of performance. And so I went to acting school after I finished my BA just for a year to figure out what it's like. And when I was introduced to the voice, it was really interesting because I felt that it opened up so many different areas for me to speak and to communicate in a completely different way when your voice is being used in a different way. And I didn't know even that stuff existed. And from there, basically, I applied for masters in voice studies in the UK, and it's a very niche subject. I think you probably know this already. There's only like 5 programs when I was researching voice studies in a master's format. And to one of the best schools called the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. And generally, you study there, you would usually go back into performance and teach in academia and that type of thing and teach more performance, which I did do for a little bit. But now I have kind of used everything that I know from that round. And since I also facilitate communications training skills and everything, I've just started blending everything together because I thought that not only do people in performance need this type of training, but also people who are in the corporate who also need to learn how to communicate better, feel good and confident in their voices. So basically where I've bridged the work, and that's what I do today in London, internationally, around the world, virtually, in person. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And that's quite a journey, because I never thought that that was an avenue. And to hear and for you to even bring to life that it was so niche when you studied it. And I still think to this day it's still a niche area, and not many people find their path in that field. And like you said, it's always the journey from after doing academia is to study and teach academia, but you took it in a whole new level, and a whole new space in regards to coaching, especially in the corporate world, which I think is really vital, where we have, people who are starting from the bottom up and haven't had the exposure to become managers, and leaders, and how to use their voice effectively in that space. So I think it's quite an important area that we probably take for granted, considering how much our voice impacts a lot of the things that we do and the spaces that we're in. So no, thank you for that. And yeah, it's really great to hear your journey. But with that being said as well, how have you found the connection between voice and diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So my thesis was written on how our cultures affect our voices. And so when I started researching that and really started linking it back to who we are as individuals and our identities and how we use our voice, it was really interesting to see, because once we start to move around in the world, and especially if you move to a place like London, completely different country, and especially if the culture is very different, if you don't come from a Western English speaking country, there's a lot of different things that are happening for each person and the way that we use our voices. And especially if we don't English in a native way, whether it be North American, South African, or in a way, sometimes we feel a little bit less than, because our language skills don't kind of up to somebody who has spoken their entire lives, and the philosophy of the use of different languages and how they sound to be understood clearly, and the way that the impact is made. And I suppose stereotypes, as well as thinking, oh, what accents sound more intelligent, or which ones, or how come you're speaking so quickly, or where is the presence in the demeanor of your voice, of how you're communicating. So when we think about culture and diversity, we all have a voice, and we're all very different people. But when we only see as, a checkbox of a skill, it's very different, because people can talk about wanting charisma, they can talk about presenting well, they can talk about effectiveness, using their slide deck and using their open and the closed body language. It's so much more than that, because each person who presents something will present it differently. And I think at the time, people often think that there's only one way to do a good presentation, one way that's really well communicated in different aspects of what they deem to be great. And so when we start to think about how diverse the workforce is that we work, the people that we work with, how international it is, how intercultural it is, we can celebrate so many different expertise that people bring in from their own experiences. And I think when that's overlooked, it gets a little boring in a way, because you don't see all the colorful parts of everybody and all can shine, rather than trying to just assimilate to one way of doing something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think if I think about my own experiences, because I migrated to the UK about 10 years ago, living in the Caribbean, we have a completely different accent to the proper English, may I say. And when I first moved here, I was in the education space and going to school, and the barrier was my accent and my voice. When I tried to communicate with teachers, with my peers in school, it was so hard for them to understand me, but equally, it was hard for me to understand them. And I know they have been, when I can remember this vivid moment where they said, you have to do an English test. And I was just like, well, English is my first language. Why do I have to do an English test? You see my grades. I was doing pretty well. And it was a little bit of an insult, because that made me recede and maybe think about, okay, this voice that I have been brought up culturally within doesn't serve this purpose or this environment. Do I then have to change my identity? Do I then have to change myself? And if so, how do I even go about it? So as a child, you don't know any better but to assimilate and try to fit in. And so I did. And I guess through the course of time, and the way in which our voice and language and culture impedes on your identity, you start to become that, that you start to assimilate to it and you start to become that of the host country. And so I felt like I started to lose my accent, and I surely have. I think in some spaces my voice sounds very different to other spaces, which is quite interesting, especially when I think about the cultures and groups I'm within, and how my voice changes and adapts to that particular group is quite interesting. I know recently I have also met up with some old school friends from the Caribbean, and they currently live in the UK. And I start to see how my voice automatically changed and the language in which I use, which at the time I wasn't conscious, but now I look back, I don't communicate like that within a corporate space. And my sister always teased me, oh, you're putting your work voice on now. So I can completely see how that has an impact. But in regards to that, why do you think that is?
It's something called coding, and it happens to everybody. And it's basically whatever that when you're with different people tend to code switch, and so almost like a similarity bias in a way, right? Because
Mm,
it helps you to connect with other people as well. So sometimes we'll find that we skill set to speak in that way, vocabulary, accent, whatever it might be. Or sometimes it's mirror neurons that you can't really control. You might find yourself speaking to someone with a completely different accent that's quite broad, and then you almost
mm,
mimicking them by accident. You're not trying to. And that's just the psychology of it bouncing between you and them. And the vocal and of the vocal articulators are kind of these things without you even being able to control it. So code switching is a very normal thing that happens.
mm,
It's not something that is good or bad. It's just something that happens, and it's not too much. I mean, you don't need to look into it too much because it's a
yeah.
very human element. But
Mm,
definitely in terms of ESL and everything, I actually
mm.
had to go through ESL as well, and I was born and raised in Canada. When I look back at it, I'm just like, maybe it's because we have some other languages at home, and that's why they put us in a group, or that because I don't remember speaking more Cantonese than English ever, and my English is definitely
Really?
better than Cantonese. Maybe it's that you pick up also how your parents speak, and we don't know that.
Mm,
Right? And that's what I'm thinking is maybe because my grammar wasn't perfect, maybe that's why they
mm,
put me in it because everybody was in it. But most of the people that when we were inside this ESL group, it's a small group, and
mhm.
we're all Asian because there's a very big Asian population where I live. And it's quite interesting. Once you brought that up, it kind of triggered some memories for me as well.
Yeah, and I think it's like you said, it's not good or bad to do so.
Mhm,
It's sometimes it happens unconsciously or even consciously. And I've been seeing some readings about, code switching, and I think at times it has that negative outlook because
mhm.
people like to say, "Oh, you're just doing it to please, another culture or a specific group." And you're not being your authentic self. So how do we then combat code switching with being authentic? Is it an insult to code switch and lose our authenticity, or how does that dynamic work, if there is even one?
I think code switching, it depends on what you identify with, and it's different for every
Mm,
individual. So you are adjusting yourself only because of your audience and not because that it's a part of you. That's when you'll shift
mm,
away from identifying as authentic, right? Because authentic is something that really feels natural to you. It feels real to you. You're not trying to put anything on. Imposter syndrome won't set in. Start to get
mm,
the feelings or thoughts inside your head asking yourself, what am I doing right now? This is not, no, these are not sounds. This is not how my mouth moves. And if those questions start to come up, then you know that something different is happening. It doesn't mean that it's bad in the moment, but that
mm,
sometimes your body will before your brain can kick in. But if your
mm,
brain kicks in first and tells you to do these things and you know it's to you, then you kind of know that you're probably sliding away from being who you actually are. Um, but to be completely honest, I think the bottom line is if you're doing it for somebody else and it's not a part, and that's when you know you're really stepping away from being the authentic you. But
mm.
another hard that complex layers really is that a lot of people don't know who they are and they don't have the
Yes.
time to figure that out, because over time they have adapted to so many different things and they've adjusted. And until they have that space to kind of freely explore what their voice should be like, and voice a long time to develop on its own if you take the time to go train it and the investment in doing that. But so in terms of who you are as a person, the ideas of how you want to speak, the styles in which how you communicate, and how you want to come across, how you want to be seen in different organizations, especially where the industries are very different in terms of how we communicate there, in our personal space, in our professional space, in our networking spaces. It's all very different, I think.
Yeah. And I think, and I totally agree with that, because if I then reflect on again on my own experiences, I have done it, and I've done it in at times to advance my career, but it was never, shall I say, I never lost a bit of myself. It was always intact of who I am and how I want to be presented and how I want to the outlook that I want to have, the reputation I want to have. It was always a part of who I am and who I am becoming, which I think what people, and do correct me if I'm wrong because you're the specialist here, but from my understanding, voice changes and it evolves and it transforms, as you rightly said, as we then understand who we are. Am I right to say that?
Yeah. And the thing that to remember is that as our voice starts to shape, as when we're babies, right, we don't really have patterns at that point, but then we'll start to have like breath holding patterns, and people tell us no, and our breath a lot more over time and through different experiences that we survive, and that's going to have an impact on the vocal quality that you're going to speak with, and also how your mindset works, and what you're allowed, what you're not allowed to say. And so when all these things start forming, that's really what makes us who we are. So yes, evolving, but it's also building habits and patterns. Sometimes these habits and patterns can serve us, but sometimes also take away our power as well. And some of it is not because it's done in a bad way. Sometimes it's just things that you were taught as you were growing up from your own parents that love you a lot, right? And sometimes you're learning this from your teachers as well. So all these different things that we're picking up with our voices, I think if we're lucky enough, we get the time and the space to be invited to back to see, why am I speaking in this way? How does my voice feel? But most people will only figure that they start to get some feedback at work or something like that makes them start to look at it. I'd say most people that start to work on their voices, they don't really have a great positive relationship with their voice because they think there's something wrong with it, or that people have given them some feedback that's actually very subjective at the same time, to kind of think about what their voice might be like. But who knows if that's the actual case, because someone's opinion is always just an opinion, unless you can say that physiologically that's how it's coming out, which most people wouldn't talk about that. They usually talk about the emotions of how it made them feel, if that makes sense.
Yes, certainly. And you've just reminded me of another situation I was in, and it was in a corporate space. And I was a part of a team, and I was leading this team, and we were on a work call. And I think, as a disclaimer, I think sometimes, especially during the time of COVID, our voice is interpreted differently through virtual settings. That's what I've realized. So when I was on this virtual meeting, we were laughing and joking, and then I got a call from my manager to say someone complained about me. And I said, okay. And I started to panic because I was just like, what's happening? And the comment that was brought to them was they didn't like my tone of voice, which was quite interesting. And I thought to myself, well, I didn't say anything out of the ordinary, and no one pointed it out at the time, and no one else has complained or reported or had that specific comment before. So it was a new phenomenon. And I think that really made me reflect on, okay, how am I using my voice? Is my voice of, how am I using the tones of my voice in particular? Is it insulting? Am I being too crude? Am I reinforcing this angry black woman stereotype? And all these different scenarios and conversations I was having in my head about how my use of voice unfortunately landed differently with someone. And it then made me not only reflect on my voice but my identity and my race and ethnicity
Mm-hmm.
because I know of the connotations that are associated with the certain uses of voice.
Mm-hmm.
So based on that, is there a connection between race and voice, identity, and voice, and how that reinforces certain stereotypes?
I think it has more to do with culture than of race, in particular, because
Mm.
stereotypes exist for a reason. There has to be, well, there has to be sorry, I'm going to say that again. There has to be enough fact or factual experiences that have happened for someone to make it a stereotype, right? But it doesn't mean
Mm.
everybody has to abide by it. But the thing is that once stereotypes start, it might be a cool stereotype, might not, and then you might feel like that you want to adhere to it because you feel like you're part of a group, and so
Mm.
and in somewhere, and that's a very human element to want to fit in. But then when we take a look at all different types of cultures within, maybe let's just say, the professional world and different industries, there's expectations of things that will mean what, the definition of professionalism will change, how the style of communication will also change. And so when we think about how we communicate, and it how interlinked, it has to do with what we're used to and what we're taught in our cultures.
Mm.
And then when we start to between cultures, what do we take with us that we do habitually and not even know subconsciously? And then
Yeah.
when you start to get that feedback, or if we're emotionally triggered and we're not sure that the emotions coming across in that way, or if it's okay
Mm.
to express this back home but it's not express it in this way in a different
Yeah.
place, those are the questions that we should actually be asking, rather than just
Mm.
doing the quick aesthetic surface link of, oh, maybe my race has to do with this, and
Yeah.
the religion has to do with this, because that doesn't
Mm.
solve the problem. And I think what's happening is that, with everything that happened since, June 2020,
Yeah.
thing. I mean, it was very loud at that point in time, but like with all news, even with the war and everything, things are novel, and then things start to kind of go into the background, but
Yeah.
it still exists, right? And
Yes.
when we can be loud, right, and there's a time and place to sort of rant a little bit and to share our
Yeah.
experiences, but then what happens after that? And it has to be if you want it to change. And
Yeah.
so when you start to ask the questions of what is interlinking it, versus just being angry about how does it actually link up, and blaming the root of the cause, versus looking what can I do right now to help people understand why it's
Mm.
coming across in this way, I think a better workforce. It helps to build a better understanding, in terms
Yeah.
of effective communication for understanding. Because
Mhm.
when people don't connect on that level through their voice, or being able to communicate through their voice, their
Yeah.
stories, in a way that is easy for the audience to understand, people don't want to get to know it, right? You have to
Yeah.
make it easy for them to understand your experience. Yes, it can be an emotional experience, but they
Yes.
won't feel it in the same way because they don't have that same experience. Some people are
Mm.
hypersensitive to understand it, but most people are not, especially in
Yeah.
the professional world, where emotions are usually held a little bit, right? And so
Yeah.
I think when you're able to ask that, that's where all the interlinks are really important.
Yeah. And that's so true because once that situation I had, once we delved into asking the why questions and what, we realized it wasn't actually my tone of voice that was an issue. It was
Yeah.
it was far deeper. And then it was a bit of a sigh of relief because for me, I thought I was held responsible for something that I had no control over.
Yeah.
But when you actually ask those really open questions and, start to look underneath the layers, it actually has nothing to do with my tone of voice, in fact, but how certain things were going on into it with that particular individual. So I think it's so true in regards to, and as you rightly pointed out, we get really loud from the events of the George Floyd murder to the most recent murder that happened, and now the war, and now the unfortunate events of the Turkey and Syria earthquake. There are a lot of things happening, and we become really loud. But how do we then turn that into action? And how do we then sustain that conversation? And through that, as you rightly said, is by continuously going under the layers and figuring out a way of a solution, of a way forward, of progress. So I think that's really important. And especially how we should address everything in life. and not just make the assumption and move on and think that it's never going to happen again. It certainly will, in another form.
Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting. And going back to the communication element, I know there are lots of individuals within the corporate space who face discrimination, stereotypes, microaggression, you name it. And there's a lot of challenges in regards to inequality. How can we then use our voice to advocate or to stand up to it, or even confront something like that in a respectable fashion, shall I say?
I think everything has to come in balance. Like you need
Mm,
to see what your environment, you need to see if it's really toxic in terms of if I said something, would it cause me more, right? Because if we don't balance these things, I think a lot of people right now are very singularly focused on if I need to
mm,
say something, I need to say something. And
mm,
it's the same with the generation. Is like comparing me to my parents. Something happened to my parents when they visited here in the
mm.
UK. My dad told my mom not to tell me because he knew I was going to
Wow.
get really triggered. He told me,
Wow.
well, she told me the next day, and it was exactly that. He knew that what was going to happen. I'm gonna go on Facebook. I'm gonna say all these things. Actually, I didn't. I respected their wishes and things like that. But things,
Yeah.
and sometimes when you think about the generational changes, even though people who are more Gen Z, millennials, they will feel the need to speak up more, but we also need to understand that the people that we're speaking up to, especially if they're high a different generation, that they need to hear it differently. And sometimes that
Mm,
there's just so much happening in terms of how work is happening, how people are looking at what their work should be like, how they should be feeling. There should be more work-life balance, and people had to trot
mm.
through without thinking about it before, right? They just did
Yes.
it. And so if we don't think about that as well, hear us in the same way, and we just kind of sometimes are seen as soft now, like snowflakes, right? And things like and that's where it comes from again, right? It's because of
Yeah.
the clash and the changes that have over time. And
Mm,
so when we're talking about needing to stand up for ourselves, yes, as a human being, and not just because of inequalities and inequities and things
mm,
like that, we need to know how to have a backbone and stand up for ourselves. But there is a very, very diplomatic way of it as well.
mm.
And across cultures, it's also very different in how you would say these different. Like in North America, we're a
Mm.
lot more direct. We use the volume a lot more than intonation voice. So it might sound
Okay.
aggressive if we're doing it in the UK, and all of a sudden,
Mm,
our coming out just loud and very direct, right? The communication is
yeah.
less direct here. And so you have to figure out frame yourself for the audience that you're speaking to, and also checking into what type of person they are.
Mm,
To be empathetic or compassionate, or is it more of a logical approach and you say what you need to say, but in a way to help them understand, to not offend them? Because a
mm,
lot of the time we're triggered, we will speak in an emotionally triggered way, which then in human connection, when you're someone from that way, from that sense, that's going to happen in the senses in their system, and it
yes.
might they're on fire by accident. And so
Mm.
that's why we have to be very careful. And I think a lot of us know, ever been in an argument, you don't make the decision right away afterwards, and to diffuse a little bit so that you can boil down all of the points back to the facts, and not just do it straight out of the emotional trigger, because usually
Mm,
we end up regretting what we say, even to our own partners, even if it's to our own family and friends. And
yeah.
definitely if we regret that with our own family and regret it in a different space as well, where you
Yeah.
might not want to be burning your bridges by accident.
Yes. And I think that's so true. I think especially for the current generation, and the millennials, it's it's and I've felt it before, and I've been in the situation where I felt, oh, I definitely need to say something because this is not right. And then you go in there and it's a whole different ball game and things just start to crumble and you're just like, okay, maybe I should have really thought this through a little bit more. So I think it's really, especially when we're looking at instances of discrimination, microaggression, for instance, we need to take stock of everything.
Mhm.
And I remember a few of my senior leaders at the time, they were just like, write down everything. if you write it down, you'll be able to see it and hear it for yourself. You'll be able
Mm-hmm.
to reflect and decide whether is it worth it, or shall I use a different way of approaching the situation. But something that you said that I probably didn't think of is understanding who I'm saying it to and
Mm-hmm.
understanding their background, because I think we sometimes fall short of, okay, I'm just going to say it, and they're going to accept it either way without thinking, how is this going to impact? What's the outcome of their response going to be? And we live a little bit short-sighted in that sense, and we don't see how it can affect the bigger picture, especially when we're in a workplace and don't want to burn bridges. So no, that's really, really interesting. And I guess for people who are in the D&I space, and working around diversity and inclusion, how can we have the confidence in using our voice to address, you know, what we see, and to senior leaders, to our CEOs and HR leaders? How can we have the confidence to speak to them about certain situations?
I think something that I've noticed is, especially throughout time, DEI has gotten a little bit more popular within corporate organizations right now,
Mhm.
anyway, is that speaking to all these different people as DEI experts or people who are professionals working within this, it's really important that you not lecture because a lot of people feel like lecturing because we facilitate, we know all this information, but people
Mhm.
don't want to be fed information like that. Most people, when they're learning and they're happy to learn, is when they're probed to be curious about things and they actually ask things
Mm.
themselves. So, really good facilitator, really good moderator in any space, not just DEI, but even workshopping for presentation skills, whatever it might be, is
Yeah.
to create that space so that if they want to learn about it. A lot of people, I think, these days now, especially that has time, it's 2023 now, that it becomes boring because people don't look forward to going into shops anymore because it was really big and people knew that they should have done it and they need to do it in 2020. And then people started getting really burnt out because it is a very, very heavy and triggering, exhausting, and everybody has their own experience with it because everybody has what they learn through life, right?
Yeah.
And until we're able to use our confidence in facilitating a way that helps them to understand, which might be more probing and asking
Mm.
questions and not just out different types of statements out there and saying this is what you have to learn, and this is why, because most of us, I would say, in the corporate space know that this all exists, but only from a this level. They don't understand it from the root up.
Mm.
And if you only understand that you need to hire based on DEI, you have to ensure that these are checked off. That's all they're looking at. They're not looking at that, right? They're not looking at skill set anymore. They're looking at how do I fill in this gap so that it
Mm.
looks this way. And so when you're thinking about it from a grassroots perspective, which is when you're talking to people higher up who have the power to make these changes
Yeah.
because they feel like they're aligned to it. It's all about authenticity, like you brought up earlier today.
Mhm.
And if it doesn't align with them, no one has the motivation to do something big about it, right? And
Yeah.
so that's our job to help them to become motivated to understand it from this point of view, why it's important for the future workforce, the existing workforce that might be seeing all these different things, so that
Yeah.
we can help them to be better. And I think
Yeah.
that's a more positive way, a positive spin on seeing how you can help them to be effective and
Mm.
not see it as the regular, oh, I have to go in to do a workshop again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, certainly. And I think there, like you rightly said, it is heavy and it is a lot to take on. And it is ongoing. It's very much ongoing. And I don't think it's going to have an ending point. It's a journey that we're all going on. So it's understandable that people do get diversity fatigue, they get
Yeah,
burnt out.
diversity fatigue, that's what it's called. Yeah. Oh, one last
It's
thing.
very, yes,
Exposure.
it's
Exposure.
sorry.
So exposure is
Mm.
a really, really good one because every time you contact with somebody, you help expose a little bit more of something, but you don't need to expose the
Mm.
whole thing. Otherwise, it's like for someone who doesn't
Yeah.
understand. Yeah.
And I think it's the small golden nuggets really that you can keep feeding and keep people engaged, because I think some and I've been in workshops and training in the past, and I'm just like, okay, this is a bit long. Just tell me what I need to know and keep it, how am I going to stay engaged with this? So I think it's really important for us to not just look at and I'm just thinking out the top of my head. When I've gone into these training, it's very much high level, what's happening now. But it's what I don't see as frequent is how and why it still happens.
Yeah.
I think the how and why would allow us to come up with the, what are we going to do next? What are the solutions we're going to have? For instance, at the moment, I'm studying my master's degree in global cultures, and the transatlantic slave trade was one of our topics. And there is so much interconnection to how slavery impacted, racism, how it developed in regards to racism, different religions and so on and so forth. And I don't hear about how that connects, and that connection relates to how we view D&I, how we view certain challenges. So there's a whole historical context that I feel that we're missing. And I think there are a lot of organizations think, oh, it's a new phenomenon. Okay, it's not. It's
Yeah.
it's actually been going on since from the beginning of time. So I think there is a painting of a story that needs to be curated in the right way in order to tell the right stories, but also in order to engage with the right people who can then say, okay, I understand. It's not a new phenomenon. It's something that's been going on. I have the resources. How can we then go about making change? So I think there is a lineage, and looking at the roots, as you rightly pointed out earlier, as to how we can really understand some of the issues that we're dealing with today. And, it's
And
years.
yeah, I think it's always existed because in terms of human relationships, something like this will
Mm,
always be existing. And I think something that would be useful in the future, coming from like a minority perspective as well, is that I think a lot of things are louder between black and white variants as well. So
mm,
so it doesn't. Some people will also feel excluded from it, like even with background, even though I feel like I'm quite Canadian and whatnot, but
mm,
to look at it from that perspective, then it's inclusive enough to include everybody as teaching people these things about our perspectives or our experiences,
mm.
because sometimes there's so one kind only, and then you don't hear about the other ones, and then you hear all this stuff in the news, and then we don't know how it actually relates. There's certain cultures that won't speak up as much, right? And then there's
Yeah,
certain ones that will speak up even more, and depending on what's happening. So I think the more inclusive we are, even from that realm, which is a completely different, not just about the general, how do I get it
yeah,
across, but actually even within our own cultures and how we
yeah,
think about it, it's really important, because even without talking about cross different races or things like that, within our own cultures, there's also slavery within our cultures as well, in terms of
yes,
classism, right? And
yes.
all this type of stuff as well, that we sometimes forget. And
Mm,
until we can explain it in this way, then and it's relevant to the person that we're speaking to, and they understand it from that perspective, which is something that they can relate a bit more to, kind of, in some sort of a
yeah,
way, then it makes a little bit more sense, and hopefully then the drop, and then the conversation can actually go a little bit further than where we started.
certainly. And there is the whole holistic approach that we need to take, isn't it? And not, when I look at, there are a lot of organizations, for instance, that I know focus on recruiting more women or recruiting more people from an ethnic background. That's all great, but there are so many nuances that exist within that we also
Mm-hmm.
have to take into consideration. Yes, I come from a Black community, but the way I identify as Black Caribbean is very different to someone who's Black African or Black American would identify themselves, and the experiences we have would have been completely different. So how do we cater for those nuances and be aware, um, and engage with those different nuances in a specific way in which we can tangibly create solutions for everyone, and as you said, to make it more inclusive. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah. And those from a voice perspective, when
Mm.
we start to get triggered, breathe. Breathe until it becomes calm, and then your voice will come back. Otherwise, all these different types of emotions that we feel in the body definitely impact how your voice will come out. It might come out really quickly. It might come out really high, lots of tension in the body. But when you start to notice that you start to feel uncomfortable as having some random type of conversation about anything really, the moment is to breathe, get that relaxation back, and so your voice can still be your voice when it comes out.
Yeah, no, certainly. And that's really beautifully said. So thank you for sharing that. So that's everything that I wanted to cover and enlighten our audience with today. Is there any last minute thoughts that you would like to leave our audience with?
I suppose be courageous. It takes a lot of
Mm.
courage to deal with DEI, use your voice, and to find the courage to use your voice in whatever aspect that you need to, whether it's just sharing an experience. It doesn't necessarily always mean you have to stand up, you have to be like that. Those are some ideas if it aligns with you, but don't feel that you need to push yourself into that space until you're right,
Yeah.
because when you want to say something, you'll feel an impulse to do it. And when you do feel it, your full voice will come out. But if we're hesitating, there's something telling us that not ready yet, and it
Yeah.
just takes a bit of time. But when your time comes, your voice will come with it.
Oh, thank you so much, Sylvie, for your time today and educating us about the interconnected relationship between voice, diversity, and inclusion. Because I think it's something that we definitely take for granted and we don't actually think about when we approach the conversation of diversity and inclusion. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront, and I really appreciate all of your insights into how we can use our voice more effectively, courageously, and with confidence to address everything that we are faced with. So thank you once
You're
again.
very welcome. I'm really happy we got to chat today.
Thank you. Have a good day. Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.